That's Debatable is sponsored by MB&G. MB&G is specialists in the esoteric world of vehicle and furniture warranty insurance, delivering quite marvellous customer service, prompt claims payment, and a highly developed understanding of how to deliver these products in a way that is both compliant with the regulations and attractive to customers. To find out more, call Paul Smith, the Managing Director, on 07887 501 441. That's 07887 501 441.
Hello and welcome to That's Debatable, the weekly podcast of the Free Speech Union. And I'm joined this week in the studio by Tanya De Grunwald, who we've known each other for a little while. We keep bumping into each other at similar events. I think I first met you at the LGBT Alliance conference a couple of years ago. And you're doing some really interesting work, which I thought the listeners and viewers would be interested to know about as well. Some of them will already know of you and probably listening to your podcast, which is called This Isn't Working. And the issues you're exploring are workplace issues and how the new kind of initiatives that some people might call woke or might be called DEI, EDI, we can explore what language we should use to explain them and to describe them. The issues those are causing for employees, for employers, and at the moment what looks like something of a turn against them. So thanks very much for making the time to come along.
Thanks very much for having me on. I wasn't really expecting my podcast to be of that great interest to lots of people when I started it. Just, you know, I'm an HR kind of a workplace expert and commentator, so I'm pleased it's got such big ramifications, really.
Yeah, and the reason I wanted to get you on this week was because you held a fantastically interesting event a day or so ago, which I came to, which was called This Is Working. And right. I think it's the first of your events that's really you're trying to set up a network of professionals. So do you want to just tell us what happened there and what it was like? Because I found it very, very interesting.
Yes, the idea was to bring together all of the people who are involved on the kind of employer side who also would accept that things have gone terribly wrong here. Like, you know, I know the sort of cases that you see at Free Speech Union. This is not where we wanted to be. This is not where good employers ever wanted to be. This was not the plan. And so the sort of the kind of nightmare scenario we've got at the moment is lots of sort of speech policing going on in the workplace. Lots of people feel that they can't bring up anything, whether it's to do with, you know, anything to do with DEI or anything more broadly within their work. They don't feel able to do their best work at the moment, and that's a problem for employers. So what I've seen is a lot of unintended consequences of some ideas that came in kind of around 2017, 2018, and then really accelerated during the pandemic. But where they've ended up is not where they wanted to be. And there's a lot of reasons why opportunities to course correct sooner weren't taken. And I think the truth is much more interesting than the kind of binary of sort of woke and anti-woke that's been laid out.
Yes, and that was what was really striking about the conversation. So you had, 40-odd people there?
Yeah, nearly 50, yeah.
Nearly 50, yeah. And these were all people from the professions, so they weren't there, it wasn't a political meeting, but it was talking about an issue which often is talked about in more political circles, but actually they were talking about the particular problems of diversity, equity and inclusion policies and programmes in the workplace, and whether there was ever something good about those, whether there's something that needs to be rescued, or whether it's a situation where the whole thing needs to be scrapped. And I think you had all views in the room. There was a kind of slash and burn advocate in the room. Yeah.
Several couple.
I would have predicted who that might have been. And so what is it what's the problem that people are talking about when they talk about DEI now? And what was it originally that DEI sought to solve as a workplace issue?
I think DEI is part of a broader kind of landscape of what I would call organisational dysfunction, which has been happening over the last couple of decades, I would say at least. And I think it was a sort of kind of trying to fix all sorts of quite deep-rooted problems, and it's pretty much gone off the rails. I think there were some ideas in there which had some merit to begin with, like what the employers were originally trying to do was to kind of broaden their talent pipelines, to get as many great people in from lots of different backgrounds, that sounds fairly sensible to me, to make sure you're really getting the very best people, rather than just the people who are the most confident or the best at doing interviews, or the people that went to private school, because those people will be more confident coming in. They really wanted to get the best people, and they didn't feel like they were getting that unless they took some extra steps to kind of welcome those people in more proactively. So there was some of that there. They also wanted to increase their retention. So, for example, hanging on to women, to female employees. So sort of making the workplace more welcoming to more different groups of people sort of felt like it would be good business. It felt like the right thing to do. And what those two things got conflated, I think, was there. That's why I thought for the first of the series for This Is Working, there's the whole club or whatever it's going to be is not just about DEI, but it's all about things that have gone wrong within the workplace. And so I thought it would be really good for them to come back to this issue of, was there ever a proper business case for DEI? Because I think the private sector particularly has a massive advantage here, which is that they can actually set their own personal politics aside if they get some skills or remember the skills they've already got. It shouldn't really be about anybody's personal politics. And in the private sector, you can say, is this good business? Is this working for our organisation? Is this increasing profit? Or is this creating more problems than it's solving? I think the public sector is a little bit different, and I can see why they and the charity sector have lost their way. But I think in the private sector, there's quite a big opportunity there. And you've also got a much better mix of people who are not bought into all of this stuff on an emotional level. They kind of never were.
Yes.
And that might sound terrible, that they are quite transactional type of people, but in a way, I think it's going to make it easier for them to unpick some of this stuff, because they do at least have the profit driver as their due north, which will help them to kind of get out of this.
And one of the things that was really striking, because it was a room of people in the private sector, was to try to, from my point of view, try to explain, well, how on earth can some of the wackier end of these ideas, the ones that everybody is talking about, the stories that make the headlines about, identity politics gone mad in the workplace, or the gender policies, all those kind of things, the insertion of pronouns into emails, all that kind of stuff, and the kind of training that some people have had to go through, which has been really quite radical, which would seem to be at odds with a normal workplace. One of the questions that was really occurring to me was, how did that come into the private sector, and how did it become so mainstreamed? Because it's not like the private sector is, flooded with blue hairs, as people talk about, the kind of young activists. There's no way that a 21-year-old graduate has affected these changes at any point during workplaces. So what's your understanding of how some of these ideas that really did seem to be a kind of university radical ideas have taken root in workplaces?
They have become, I would say, more radical. They didn't seem as radical at the time. And I was working in this area. I've actually been doing a lot of work for fair pay for interns for years and years. And so I named and shamed lots of big employers that had unpaid interns, which is actually illegal in this country if they're doing something that's a job. So I named and shamed Tony Blair and Simon Cowell and Philip Green, and that was a lot of fun. That became part of what we would now see as social mobility, which was part of what we now call DEI. It was called diversity and inclusion at the time. And that was around kind of 2015, 2016. So things were sort of moving in that direction, and there was definitely a cultural kind of move, wasn't there, to be kind of more what we would call inclusive. All I can say is it didn't really seem like there was a downside to it, unless you were really paying attention, unless you had studied these sorts of movements in the past. It just kind of felt modern, it felt fresh, it felt like, of course we want to include people from different backgrounds. I think there was probably a bit of embarrassment and a bit of shame that too many organisations had not been terribly friendly to different groups in the past. It was a bit embarrassing. They were embarrassed about race, they were embarrassed about LGBT, they were embarrassed about women. So they kind of did it as like this will be great, what could possibly go wrong? I think what happened and what I saw happening, so between 2018 and 2024, I was running a different club, which was called the Good and Fair Employers Club, which was for the head of early careers at lots of big organisations. So the person that does graduates and recruitment, graduates and apprenticeships recruitment particularly. at lots of big firms. So, Clifford Chance, Accenture, Vodafone, GSK, NHS. And I would bring them together to talk about, the problems that they were having and, share their challenges and solutions, which was great. I think it just sort of seemed like that was what, the early careers bit was the easiest place to affect the biggest change the fastest, because that's where they're doing their volume recruitment. So if you're embarrassed that you haven't got enough women, or you're embarrassed you haven't got enough ethnic minorities, that's probably the place to start if you're a big organisation that hires at scale like that, really. So it just sort of felt like giving young people a chance. It was a way to hire kind of rough diamonds, I suppose. They were already hiring a load of, the same people. People who went to private school were overrepresented. Were they the best people, or were they just the most confident people? So there was genuinely a feel that this was meritocracy and that what they had before wasn't. And they wanted to modernise their workplaces. And it just felt like, I don't know, it sounds silly now, doesn't it? But it felt like the right thing to do in that moment.
And to what extent do you think by that stage real discrimination was still a problem in the workplace? Is that part of what was being addressed, or really had that already been dealt with by other measures?
It's really hard to say. The sort of organisations I was working with, I don't think there was a huge amount of actual discrimination. You're talking about a lot of kind of white collar jobs particularly. I don't remember seeing loads of evidence for it. It was more anecdotal stuff. Like, I remember, I think it was in 2018, H&M ran an ad campaign, and there was a little boy in a T-shirt that said "naughtiest monkey in the jungle" in their children's range. And the little boy modelling this T-shirt was black. And there was a big thing about it. And obviously, looking back, that was the wrong child to be modelling that T-shirt. There was a huge thing about, how H&M had gone so wrong. Things like that, I think, made them go, "Oh, that was terrible." I think that was a mistake. Some people think it was some kind of press kind of story that they created. I don't think it was. So things like that made them think, "Oh, they're making mistakes because they haven't got the right representation in the room." Maybe that's a big leap, but those sorts of anecdotes, being named and shamed for having boards that were, they would say, all pale, male and stale, that was very real. Social media was coming up. Young people were becoming very active about saying, look at the state of your board. So anything that you did wrong, any kind of racism story, any kind of sexism story, your board would be shamed for not being diverse enough. So they were under a bit of pressure there, they felt, and they needed some quick fixes, and this probably was it.
And who were they being shamed by? I mean, it isn't just the media, is it? I mean, were there sort of requirements being placed on business to meet new criteria that were not straightforwardly profit-based?
I don't think so at the time. I really don't think so. Not that I recall. Not that I recall. It felt very much like it was coming from a sort of social pressure, and also from the young people that they were hiring. And I think, to be fair, lots of senior people, people in these big corporations, they're not aliens. They're regular people. And they kind of felt a bit embarrassed that they didn't have the right mix of people. There are some people in those organisations who themselves had come from tough backgrounds and done well for themselves and thought, actually, we do need to be more socially diverse, more racially diverse. I'd like to, bring people up from different backgrounds. So a lot of that stuff was good stuff. The problem was that there were no guardrails around it. And by the time they realised that it had got out of control, there was no way to challenge it, which is, I think kind of where the free speech issue comes in, really, because it became very, very difficult to say, hang on, I'm not sure about some of this stuff. Are we still achieving whatever it was we were trying to achieve in the first place? And actually, what were we ever doing? Was there ever a business case for this, really? And I think at that time, to be fair to them, and I don't know how fair your viewers are feeling. I know these people have made a lot of mistakes. I know there's not that much sympathy for them. But there was a big industry around pressuring companies to feel like they should be doing more. So, for example, McKinsey, who are I think probably the biggest management consultancy in the world, they're a big global firm. They published 4 different reports which suggested very, very strongly that there was a business case for diversity, for demographic diversity, so particularly race and sex. So they basically published these 4 reports between, I think, 2015 and 2023, something like that, pushing this message. And they are very well regarded now, but they are not known for academic research. So their reports, which everyone thought of as being brilliant because their name is so well respected, actually, it turns out, are incredibly flimsy and are more really like a sort of marketing report. Should never really have been taken seriously. But I still hear people referring to McKinsey reports as if those are credible.
Yes, and the speaker you had the other night was Professor Alex Edmonds from the London Business School, and I think he's taken apart it didn't take much doing from what he said, one of the McKinsey reports. So what is it? All four.
Yeah.
And so what did he find? I mean, I thought he did a fantastic presentation. It was really, really interesting and very measured, very nuanced, which is always refreshing. So what is it that has now been found by people like Professor Edmonds?
Well, that there is no correlation there at all. Mm-hmm. He's actually British Chinese himself, and he says one of the reasons why he's been able to publish this his work and be taken seriously is because he's an ethnic minority himself. And he genuinely thinks that it would be more difficult if he was white because it would just be assumed that he was just anti-woke, people might say. So I think he's probably one of the most forensic people when it comes to breaking this stuff down. Just that there is no correlation here for all sorts of reasons. It just isn't there. But the myth is already there. There's a kind of McKinsey myth around all this stuff now. I do hear also a lot of people in the UK talk about affirmative action, which we've never had in the UK. So what the Americans would call affirmative action, putting people into roles because they're black or because they're female, for example, that's illegal here. It always has been. That would be called positive discrimination. So I can always tell when I'm listening to a DEI supposed expert whether they mention the McKinsey reports and whether they start talking about affirmative action and whether they really whether they understand the difference between America and the UK.
Well, that's really interesting because so many of the conversations in both directions, really, both the criticism of DEI and DEI itself has been a kind of transplantation of American trends and ideas across here, and in some ways a very unhelpful imposition of American racialised thinking and politics onto the British context, which doesn't fit, and people have written about this. So, but nevertheless, what was really interesting the other night was in the room you had people who were diverse. In what way would you judge that? Well, of course, you're doing it on very superficial criteria, what they look like. Have they got an obvious disability, not an invisible disability? Have they got a different black skin colour or brown skin colour or white skin colour? Do they declare their sexuality? And so once you're in a room with people having a very frank conversation, it does get very silly to try to think about what significance you might give to those characteristics. Whereas, of course, when it's on paper or in a report or it's statistical, or when people are talking at a distance, you can see why people can talk about people in their absence.
Yeah.
And it was really, really interesting you had a guy there, I think he's been on your podcast, who uses a wheelchair. I don't know what his disability is, but he was very, very frank about the fact that he has a disability, that it is one that really makes a difference and that requires additional support for him to be in the workplace. And then the point he was making is that is a world away from a lot of the things that are now being treated as characteristics or traits that people might have, or issues or problems the people are making claims for additional support, whereas actually he needs far more of it than they ever would, and maybe things are being bent out of shape by some of these criteria. So that was really interesting, I thought. What did he say when he was on your podcast?
You're talking about my friend George Fielding, who is an absolute one-off. I think he's probably 31 now, wheelchair user. And he's been really frank about how difficult it has been for people with disabilities to advocate for what they need, and how an awful lot of other groups have kind of piled in. And there's a lot of this sort of self-identifying as having a disability, as being disabled, which he finds not only incredibly offensive, but also incredibly annoying, because these people are just sort of crowding in and snatching the mic. And we're lumping in mental health, neurodiversity, trans identities, all in together, when actually these are all very different things, and none of them, and people should be able to advocate for disability like separately. I think one of the great shames, and I really mean shame, of the DEI movement as it was, has been that disability has been almost completely ignored. as has class, but disability, I would say particularly. And if I think about all the money that's been spent on, for example, Pride, which I'm not sure there's any evidence this has improved anything for anybody, if you'd spent even half of that on disability, where we would be now. And I think that is incredibly embarrassing. Of all the things I think we should be embarrassed about when it comes to DEI, I think that's probably the worst one. I think in terms of who was in the room that night, I agree with you, it was very diverse in lots of different ways. Part of the reason for that was because I brought together people from different parts of the business, any business. Obviously, these weren't all colleagues working for each other, but we had in the room, we had business owners, we had senior managers, very senior executives, some of them. We had some lawyers in-house as well. We had recruiters, there were some headhunters, we had early careers people, we had risk people. So you had actually from sort of across business, I thought it became very clear. I didn't know actually how that event was going to go. First of all, I didn't know if anyone was going to turn up, but and they did, which I'm thrilled about. And I think they knew it was going to be interesting as it was. But it was very interesting. I think everybody had a little piece of the puzzle in that room. And I think what we're seeing is DEI, is easy to pin on HR, and there is plenty of blame to go around, and HR deserves much of it. But what are the risk people doing? There's a whole department called risk. Quite often these organizations have an actual role called the chief risk officer. What is that person doing that is allowing male staff to use the female changing room, for example? That is a risk. Why are they not paying attention? So we began to hear from some of the risk people in the room saying, well, it's because the risk people don't take people risk as seriously as they should do. And there are various reasons for that. They're looking at things like cyber risk and market risk. So they're not really interested in people. So, we're beginning to sort of scratch the surface of what's gone wrong here. And it's a lot of things have gone wrong. And I think it's very easy to blame activists. And the activists have been very strong. But at the same time, I think leadership has been extremely weak. And so I think as well as looking down to the annoying 22-year-olds who are, I get it, very annoying, and they're not all 22, some of them are older, I think we need to look up to the leaders and say, hey, what did you think you were being paid such a huge salary for to allow this organization to become this place where people can't say what they need to say, they can't get their work done? How did this not get stopped sooner? And I think had there been stronger leadership at most of these organizations, I think this would not have got out of control as it has. I think they didn't think it was that important. I think they just thought a lot of this stuff was fluff. They didn't take it seriously. The main people complaining about it were probably middle-aged women because the trans stuff was so difficult and so controversial. So I think they just sort of thought, it's just all this, there's a few women, there's a few, whatever, it's just the fluff stuff. They thought it was an easy way to sort of virtue signal, and they didn't take it that seriously. And now it's blown up in their face, but they don't have a culture where they can talk about this stuff openly. And so the problem is very developed and, big, but they're at very embryonic stages of being able to talk about it within the workplace.
Yes, well, that's what's so interesting from the Free Speech Union point of view, is obviously we've represented people from, I would say, all levels of organisations, but I think actually the ones that strike everybody the most, and probably the ones that have made the news, is actually just very normal employees. I don't want to say the bottom of organisations, but certainly not management, not senior management, who have fallen foul of, well, what I always say is tripwires they didn't even know existed. Sometimes it's women who've raised questions about gender identity policies, which have kind of affected their feeling of safety in the workplace and other kinds of sense of fairness. And they maybe they knew what they were challenging and they could see the import of it. But then a lot of other people who just kind of tripped over by the vocabulary they used, or by literally asking a question. So that idea that actually people who I always would assume are very valuable employees, because they will actually tell the truth, and they will say, it's a bit like Emperor's New Clothes, without being an idiot about it, but they will actually say, well, nobody else seems to have said this, but are you all thinking what I'm thinking? Or has anybody else noticed this? And they will be the person that says it. And it is very difficult in human culture, isn't it? Because a lot of people do tend to go along with the crowd, but you really, really need the outlier, the maverick, the outspoken person to be part of any culture. So what do you think has happened to those people over the last period? Because we do hear reports of self-censorship, people leaving. I mean, so one of the things I went back to in preparation for this conversation was a report that the Free Speech Union put out early last year by my colleague Tom Harris. We called it the EDI tax, how equity, diversity and inclusion is hobbling British businesses. And that was based on a survey of 800 people who had gone through some kind of training along the kind of EDI lines. And what was really interesting in that, and it was, we were all kind of gasping when we were presented with the results, because employees did not like it. Very large numbers, high proportion of employees did not like the training they'd been given. They didn't agree with it, and they didn't feel that they could question it. And that applied more to employees from a minority background than even to other employees, which I thought was the most fascinating finding of the whole thing. So just a little stat I've got here, which is 31% of people had left a former employer because of that employer's endorsement of what was termed woke ideology. This proportion was higher amongst minority groups, 43% for black respondents, 46% for Asian respondents, and 46% for LGBT, which I think that's so interesting. And we kind of talked about that as a brain drain. So, but the backlash is often presented as a kind of zero-sum game, that somehow minorities have won and a white majority or heterosexual men have all lost out. What's your assessment of what's actually been the outcome of these kinds of policies in workplaces? Who are the winners and losers? Can we even say?
Doesn't really feel like anyone's winning at the moment, does it? Who's winning? I don't think anyone is. I think what we're seeing there is the short-term strategy. The best short-term strategy really is not to say anything, because you see what happens to people that do, and you think, well, I'm not going to do what he or she's just done, because they've just been kind of pushed out. So you have to sit through some absolute nonsense training, and then you tick a box, and you never have to see this person again, this nutty trainer, and that's the last of it. Or so you think. And you just think, whatever, you never think about it again, or you think it was crazy. But if we all do that for long enough, then you end up where we are now, which is that there are no standards around any of these things. There are no standards for diversity training, as people have probably discovered because of the nonsense that people have been taught by these amazing educators. And it was always very clear that you weren't allowed to challenge this stuff. If you've ever sat through one of these sessions, you can't say, hang on, where's the evidence for this? I've got a question. Because it just, it's like, it goes down like an absolute lead balloon. Mm-hmm. So, and it didn't, and probably ethnic minorities tend to be pretty good at knowing which battles to pick, and that's not the battle to pick. Mm-hmm. There's all sorts of things that bug people all the time, people with disabilities as well. They listen to stuff all the time. They're like, I just can't pick every single fight. I'm not going to pick this fight. I will just tick the box. I will say I thought it was great, or I just won't say anything. Mm. And that's how it's been allowed to continue. And so there isn't any negative feedback when these people come in, because no one can be bothered. Mm-hmm. But then you end up here. I think that's what's happened.
And do you think that has a corrosive effect right the way through the culture of a company? Because I can't see how it doesn't, really. And if you have that kind of bad faith, people just being pissed off, to be frank, with not trusting management because they think management somehow believe in this stuff. You've got these poor quality external trainers in some cases, but then what we found, I think it was only 35% of employers engaged an external company. So actually a lot of this training had been incorporated into internal processes in the company, which is even worse, because you can't all sit there and moan about the external trainer afterwards. It's your colleague in HR or whoever the person is who's kind of back there the next week to see what you thought of the training. So what do you think about that effect that it's all had on the kind of culture within workplaces?
I think actually Alex Edmonds was very good on this the other night, I thought, in that if you're demonstrating in your diversity training that speaking up is not welcome, then you can't really be surprised if people in a totally separate matter that's got nothing to do with diversity, they're working on a project that's going wrong and they think it's going wrong and this is doomed, this project, but they don't want to say anything because they can tell everyone else is loving it or no one else is going to back them up if they say, I think this is a mistake, we need to look at this again, you then get people just starting to say, oh, do you know what, I don't really care about this project, I don't really care about this company anymore, I actually don't really care about my job anymore, I'm going to go and work from home as much as possible, I'm going to spend as little time with these awful people as I need to, I used to like this company and now I don't. And that's really, really bad for employers. This is why I've said for a long time, this is not good for employers. This is not where they wanted to be. This is, we know about groupthink. We've known about groupthink for decades and decades, and we've created groupthink. These organisations have spent a huge amount of time and a huge amount of money making their own organisation worse. That's what's been happening for the last 10 years or so. And I don't, it's going to be difficult to correct it, I think, because it's not just the case you can't just click your fingers and say to everyone, sorry about the last 10 years. I'm really sorry about that. What was that? That was weird. We now want you to speak up, say whatever you want. I mean, good luck with that. Also, a lot of the best people, as you say, will have left by now. They will have slowly left. They will have, gone set up their own businesses, or they will have retired a bit early, or they'll just be doing their own thing. They will have moved to a different industry. You can't just expect them to come running back. So I think it's going to be really difficult, even if we could, click our fingers and change all this tomorrow. I think the employers have got a challenge on their hands. And it's so crazy to me because before all this, they used to say, our people are our biggest asset, they're our most important resource. We want the best people. There was this thing called the war for talent. I used to hear, and they'd refer to their staff as talent, with some kind of respect there. And then where we've got to now is just the opposite. And this is not, you've got rid of your best people. You've kept, frankly, your worst people. You've kept the people who were happy just to keep nodding away and nodding stuff through that they knew was nuts. And you've lost all your best people. I mean, I've got this idea that the council people are the people that we now need back. Yeah. We should be begging them. We should be throwing money at them. Please come back. You were totally right.
Yeah. That's your next recruitment company idea.
I think there's also a thing about being seen to be negative in workplaces. If you're the kind of person who's really good at seeing problems, which I am actually, I called my podcast "This Isn't Working." Some people are really good at seeing problems. Some people are really good at coming up with solutions. Those are actually two different types. And I think Alex Edmonds would call that cognitive diversity, just as being a big picture thinker or being a detail person is also cognitive diversity. And so what we did was we just got rid of all the people who are really good at going, this is a mistake, I think we should stop and look at this again. And so now you've only got it's all going to be great, guys, it's all going to be fine people. And then, too many of them is a problem as well.
Yeah. Yes, no, that's really interesting because even within the Free Speech Union, which obviously we're, 28 employees now, and because I've seen it grow over 5 years from a couple of us to that many, it is really, really interesting to see how you can have very, very different people working together. And actually it's really necessary to have these different qualities and traits and ways of thinking all rubbing along together somehow. And obviously, I don't know how you scale that up because that is God knows how you do that on a large corporation, and how you have a culture that is able to cultivate that proper diversity of individuals and not squash it and kind of push people into particular directions. And then, like you say, people fall by the wayside who don't fit in, but actually are nevertheless necessary because they are the person that will ask that question or will smooth something over even. The person, you need somebody to smooth things over, say, well, actually, that's a priority, and maybe let's just park that one. And then another person will just hammer on about the same thing because once they've got to be in their bonnet, and they're important because they do that. But you can't necessarily be thrown off kilter by the person with the more obsessive kind of idea. So it's, I've never worked in a large corporation. I've never worked in the private sector. I was in academia and various other places before that, so I don't know what these problems look like. But presumably there's kind of a science to this. Alex Edmonds is from the London Business School. People do write academic papers on this kind of stuff, so it can't all be fluff and waffle. So do you think that applied thinking will get us out of this mess, or will it take a sort of professional activism from the kind of people that might be in your network to really make a change? How do you think we'll get out of the hole?
I think it'll be a combination. We definitely need to bring data back in, bring evidence back in. People like Alex are great. He's a very moderate voice. And I think we need to normalise that. I think we need to also normalise spaces like what I achieved this week, which I didn't, I thought it was possible. I think a lot of people didn't think that community was there. I thought they were there because I've seen them on LinkedIn a lot. These are what you might call centrists, but I don't actually even know what their personal politics are. Some of them are very noisy about their personal politics, but mainly they're not. And I think that's kind of where we've gone wrong. I don't tend to talk about my own personal politics either, because actually it's not relevant. You know, people's religion isn't relevant. Like, this is where we've gone wrong. We need to take ourselves out of the conversation and say, look, you know, lots of different people work at this organisation. Some of them believe these things. Some of these believe these things. These are people's, how are we going to make this work so that everyone can kind of rub along together and get the best work done, and we can minimise aggro and grievances, we can maximise productivity and retention. There must be a way to achieve that that's also legally compliant. The lawyers as well. I mean, I've got a bit of a thing about the lawyers. The lawyers like to blame HR. I mean, everyone likes to blame HR, don't they? But I mean, the lawyers like to blame HR, and everyone always takes the lawyers' side because they're the clever ones, obviously. But I think the lawyers have actually got a lot of soul searching to do themselves. And one of the things that I think we talked about the other night was that lots of HR people are saying, well, actually, we don't really consult our lawyers anymore. Or we do, but they always give us this advice, which is, well, you could do this or you could do that. But, that doesn't really help us. So we end up, I've heard people say to me, we end up doing what feels legal.
Yeah.
I mean, if that's not a and then you see the Darlington nurses case and you think,
yes,
that felt legal, didn't it? Somebody said that feels legal. So I think the lawyers have got a lot of questions to answer as well. And there are big firms, including Eversheds, including Clifford Chance, who've actually been giving really bad advice, particularly around, what they would call trans inclusion, where I thought actually it was very interesting in the room. I don't know if you noticed, but if there was anybody who was challenging the Supreme Court ruling in any way, they were not speaking up in that room. It seemed to me like there was consensus among the people in that room that the Supreme Court ruling has clarified things, and we need to get on with that. And if you haven't already implemented that, then you should have done. Again, I think that's a private sector thing. I know there are still problems with getting absolutely everybody to do that, but I thought there was definitely consensus there, and nobody challenged that at all. And I think generally, they use the word woke a little bit, I think, and I think we need a better word for it, because I think that can be quite, I don't know, it can feel a bit divisive, can't it, that word? But I think progressive politics, that sort of language, I think, can be helpful. I think people now know what they mean by that. I've found it quite difficult. I have kind of avoided using the word woke on the podcast because I think it can sound, a little bit antagonistic in a way, and I wanted to bring as many people in as possible. But I think now even the centrist people know what we mean by that stuff, and it's the nuttier end, it's the extreme end of what we were trying to call inclusion, and that kind of got way too politicized. I think it's quite hard to find, sensible people who don't think that the workplace is too politicized. I mean, I say, when I tell people what I do, and I talk about the workplace becoming, too political and employers finding it a problem, nobody seems to question what I mean by that. It's much, people are getting it now.
So in that sense, so a lot of people, I know you've talked about this on your podcast, a lot of people will have been delighted when DEI has been politicised in the US, for example. What do you think, do you think it will take some kind of level of politicisation to really draw out the problems with it, and to force a culture shift and a shift in the way of thinking, and maybe some legislative change? But do you think there's also problems with that as well?
I think the devil's in the detail with this stuff, and a lot of people, I think, don't know what they're talking about when they say DEI. Does that include having a kind of insight day for people with disabilities to come in and see the workplace before they apply for a job, for example, to show that they're inclusive of people, with disabilities? Does it include having a really good maternity policy, for example? Does it include, making sure that your company culture, doesn't, the sort of social side of it doesn't revolve around drinking, for example? Is this DEI, or is this just this thing called culture, which also nobody can define that any better than they can define DEI? So it's like, what are we actually trying to do here? Whatever we're trying to do. And I think it'll be different for different companies. And I think one of the reasons why it's gone so wrong is that they haven't been able to talk to each other. And I think there was a role. I think there's been many failures. I'd like to point out the CIPD, the Chartered Institute of Personnel Development, which has failed to create a space for free speech, really, for employers. They are supposed to be doing that job. And then they're also meant to be upholding standards and training and professionalism, which they haven't been doing either. But I think more broadly, and this isn't just HR, the conference industry, I think, has got questions that need to be asked. If you're an industry conference organizer, your role is to create a space for the best, most important conversations within that industry to be happening. What I see happening is conference organisers have decided they want to maximise revenue, sometimes by charging the people paying to attend, or sometimes that's free, but they're charging the people on the stage to be on the stage. They charge the panelists at these things, they charge for sponsorship, they charge for stands, and as a result, the quality of the discussion has dropped through the floor. I mean, I went to the CIPD Festival of Work, which is their kind of workplace conference. Pretty much everybody, was paying to be on the stage, apart from Jamie Lang from Made in Chelsea, and Alex Scott, the footballer, who presumably being paid. I'm thinking, wait, what are we doing? We should be paying excellent speakers to bring the best information, and that's not happening. So I think those conversations haven't been happening, and I think press officers as well have been very controlling of their kind of senior execs, saying, no, you can't go to that event, you can't speak freely about the problems in the industry. So everyone's made the same mistakes, and they've all followed each other off the cliff, basically. When if they'd all been allowed to talk to their peers and competitors, they could have realised, actually, are you thinking some of this stuff's gone a bit crazy? We are too. Oh, God, thank God for that. I thought it was just us.
Yes.
And they might have been able to stop it sooner. So I think there's a definite questions around that as well.
Oh, well, that's so fascinating. And and I think what you did this week with your networking event and with the podcast, how long's that been going for? Over a year?
2 years, yeah.
2 years, yeah. This Isn't Working, which people should subscribe to.
Thank you.
I just think there's a really serious conversation to be had here, which is, although the politics around this are always very interesting, and we all have strong views on lots of aspects of this, but actually, once you get within the specificity of particular areas of life, that's when you have to get really serious about it, and you can't just throw around woke, anti-woke, whatever it might be. You have to actually get stuck into the actual problems, and I thought it was really, really encouraging.
We have to start talking. There's no other way through this. I can't see any other way through this, can you? I mean, we just have to start talking.
Yeah.
These problems are not going to fix themselves, and the grown-ups need to come back into the room and remember what it sounds like to speak professionally and seriously to your colleagues and your peers and find solutions to these problems which we've created for ourselves, unfortunately.
Yeah, brilliant. And I think that, you're definitely starting something that really, really is so necessary. So congratulations on that, and thanks for joining me. So thanks very much, and do listen again next week, and do check out Tanya's podcast, This Isn't Working. Thank you.